Hello students, this is Dr. Lyons, and in this video we're going to talk about the things in the ocean that have backbones but breathe air. So we're going to talk about the marine mammals, the marine reptiles, and the marine birds. So this you can probably tell is a marine reptile. This is a green sea turtle. It's one of the two major sea turtles that you find in the Caribbean. This one has a kind of like flattened beak, whereas a hawksbill sea turtle has a sharper kind of beak. So first, kind of an overview on the things that we're going to talk about today, right? So we're going to be talking about things that breathe air, things that have backbones like us, things that are tetrapods, or at least their ancestors are tetrapods. So those are things with four limbs. So tetra meaning four and pod meaning foot. And these are all things that have terrestrial ancestors, right? So things that were once on land and essentially evolved back into being in the water. So let's work through the sort of evolutionary kind of trajectory, I guess you might call it here, right? So we start with fishes, like this lungfish, still living thing today. Uh, This lineage of fishes gave rise to these semi-aquatic, part fish, part amphibian things known as tiktaalik and some other things kind of along the way. This gave rise to then all of the tetrapods that live on land, right? So the amphibians, the birds, the reptiles, the mammals, right? All of these four groups all came about from tiktaalik. And of some of these, certain groups said, you know what, being on land sucks. We're going to go back to the ocean. And so from each of these groups, different ones moved back into the ocean and then became aquatic tetrapods. So tetrapods that live in the ocean, such as this whale here. So we're kind of talking about things that were in the water, were on land, and then went back into the water. So we're going to go through each of the four major groups of air-breathing vertebrates in the ocean. And so the first one that I want to talk about are the marine reptiles. So these include the sea turtles, they include sea snakes, they include some crocodiles, and they include marine iguanas. So the one that we'll focus on the most are the sea turtles because they're probably the most common and the most widely distributed of the various things. Like so marine iguanas, for instance, they're only found in the Galapagos. Sea snakes are only found in the South Pacific, places like Australia, Indonesia, Philippines. Marine crocodiles are really only found in the South Pacific, but sea turtles are found in a lot of different waters throughout the Earth. So sea turtles, a little bit about them. So these are some terms we learned about way back in, I don't know, maybe like chapter 5 or 6 or something like that. So they are poikilotherms and they're ectothermic. Poikilotherm meaning that their temperature varies, and ectothermic meaning that they lose most of their heat to the environment around them. The notable exception is leatherback sea turtles. So their temperature varies because they are poikilotherms, but they maintain a lot of heat inside. They don't lose all of their heat to the environment around them, meaning that they are endothermic, endo meaning inside, therm meaning temperature. They're endothermic rather than being ectothermic. How sea turtles feed themselves is most of them either eat invertebrates, so things like jellyfishes or sea anemones or corals, and some eat algae or plants. For instance, there's a type of seagrass found in the Caribbean called turtlegrass, which you can imagine is eaten by turtles. So how they reproduce is kind of interesting. So sea turtles breed at sea. It's a very, very awkward process. I've seen it once myself, because both the male and the female are trying to, stay afloat so they, don't suck in a bunch of water. And the male trying to kind of gets up on top of the female and then falls off, and gets up on top of the female and then falls off. And it can take hours because you can imagine at the surface of the ocean, if there's waves kind of rocking around back and forth, and you're a sea turtle with a round shell trying to get up onto another sea turtle with a round shell, it's pretty difficult. But obviously they persevere, and they've been doing this for millions of years, and so that's how they breed at sea. Females return to the place where they were born in order to lay their eggs. Kind of the thought as to why they do that is because if a female has made it to adulthood so that she can reproduce, then obviously her parents made, or her mom made a good decision to lay the eggs right there. So that's why females in general go back to the place where they were born. Then the juveniles hatch out of the eggs, even though both of these pictures, look like they're during the day. By the way, I didn't take these photos. I would love to see any of these things happen, but haven't yet. Typically, it happens at night. Females will go up onto the shore at night, lay their eggs, and then a month or two later, the little babies will emerge also at night and make a mad dash for the ocean. They do these things at night to avoid predators, which of course they still run into some predators. As you can see here, but way less than if they were to do this during the day. So the deepest diving of the sea turtles are leatherback sea turtles, so that one that are endothermic. And they can get down to something like 3,000 feet, so maybe like 2/3 of a mile they can dive down. And for each of the groups that we go through today, I'll talk about which is the deepest diver of the group. So I've got a few cute sea turtle pictures. So there's a green sea turtle in there's another green sea turtle in Indonesia. And there's a hawksbill sea turtle in the Red Sea in Egypt. So I've got some bad news about sea turtles, and the bad news is that every single species of sea turtle is threatened. Of all the things in the ocean, these sea turtles seem particularly prone to the effects of humans. So what are the threats to sea turtles? So people eating them, either eating the eggs or eating the adults. Getting caught in nets is something that can happen to them that's bad. Swallowing plastic bags that they mistake for food, that can happen, and that's bad, which is why you should all be using reusable bags, not single-use plastic bags, which can oftentimes make their way to the ocean. When their nesting areas go away because hotels or other developments have gone onto the beach that take away that nesting area, that's problematic. And another thing that can be problematic for the little hatchlings is light pollution. So how baby sea turtles typically navigate from the egg out to the ocean is that they look for the light from the full moon. So that's why baby sea turtles typically hatch during a full moon, is because the light is like a beacon that leads them out to the ocean. However, if there's a big city right next to the beach that's producing its own light, then the little baby sea turtles can go the wrong way because they get confused. So that's another major problem for sea turtles. I should say that with a lot of these things, it's getting better. In most places, it's illegal to harvest sea turtles and to eat their eggs. In a lot of places where people are using nets to fish, there are turtle-safe nets that allow turtles to get out. And in places like California and some other places, we're now banning plastic bags. So things are getting better for sea turtles, but they're all still considered threatened. Okay, let's talk about seabirds a little bit. So like the turtles, they nest on land, but they eat marine organisms. So some of the examples include the penguins. Those are the things that live down in the Antarctic and in places like the very southern tip of South America, and the same as New Zealand. There are terns. There are plovers, which you see in this picture right here. That's what's known as a piping plover. Pelicans, which we have here on our coastline in California, includes all those things. So these guys are all carnivores or scavengers, right? So they either hunt for prey and kill and eat live prey, or they scavenge things that other organisms have already killed. For instance, you've probably seen lots of seagulls, the parking lots of like Burger Kings and In-N-Out Burgers. They're basically scavengers. So it is worth noting that of all the things we're going to talk about today, The seabirds are the only group that includes some things that don't actually swim. So like this plover, for instance, it is not a swimmer. It eats things out of the ocean, but it itself is not a swimmer. Whereas this penguin is a swimmer. They're clearly the best swimming of the birds. They're really, really good at it. In this one here is what's known as an emperor penguin, which their deepest dives are down to something like 1,800 feet. But the kind of side effect of that is that even though these penguins are great at swimming, they have gotten so good at that that now they're not so good at flying. In fact, they can't fly at all. So penguins are a flightless type of bird. And seabirds in general are like us in terms of temperature. So they are homeothermic. So the prefix homeo meaning the same and therm meaning temperature. So they maintain the same internal temperature all the time. And they are endothermic, meaning that a lot of the heat they produce stays right on the inside, doesn't go anywhere. So they are a lot like us. You know, all of us, we keep an internal temperature of 98.6 roughly, and that temperature stays the same. These birds, you know, they of course all have different set temperatures that their bodies keep themselves at, but those temperatures don't vary. They stay right where they are. Here's one of my favorite types of seabirds. This is what's known as a puffin. Puffins have a really cool adaptation in that they have a little hook. Their tongue is like a little hook. So what they can do is they can dive down into the water, catch one fish, and then hold it under their tongue with their little hook-like tongue. So that way then they can open their beak without the fish swimming out of there. So they can then catch another fish and then hook that under their tongue, and then catch another fish and hook that under their tongue, and then another one and hook that under their tongue. So that's why puffins can catch, you know, dozens of fish in any one fishing trip before they return to their nest. And their nests look kind of like this, like there are these little holes in the ground that the little chick is living in. So the male and females will kind of take turns going in catching fish for the chick, and then in guarding the chick. And that's what these ones are doing here. They're all waiting for their mate to return with a meal for their chick, which are, you know, hidden inside of these burrows that you see here. Okay, let's talk about marine mammals now. So these are obviously going to be the things most similar to us because we are mammals. That's me. I very much consider myself a marine mammal given how much time I spend in the water. In marine mammals, like the rest of mammals, are homeothermic and endothermic. So our temperatures don't vary, and our temperatures are warmer than the surrounding environment. How we do that, or how marine mammals keep warm, is some have hair, some have blubber, some have both. Right? So hair insulates. Blubber is a type of fat, which is a very good insulator. That's how they keep warm. So all of the marine mammals have internal fertilization, right? Just like the mammals on land, marine mammals have some version of sex that is not so different from how we have sex. So that's internal fertilization. And some of these do it in the ocean. Some of these do it on land. It depends on the group. In terms of birthing, you know, young marine mammals, again, some of it is done at sea and some of it is done on land. It depends on the group that we're talking about. So a lot of why people are so excited about marine mammals is that they have large brains and they have very complex behavior. And they all have very striking personalities. So it's really, really fun to interact with marine mammals because they are very, you know, they do have very strong personalities and they very much react to you. Probably one of my favorite experiences with marine mammals underwater was with sea lions. I was looking at something on the sea floor with my fins kind of extending up towards the surface. And a baby sea lion was kind of like biting at my fins and playing with my fins. But I had no idea that it was going on because I was looking at a small fish on the bottom. And then afterwards, my wife told me that in fact a sea lion was playing with my fins. Right, so they're very playful, very intelligent animals. Marine mammals are. And there are 4 different groups of them that we're going to talk about in this chapter. So the first group that we'll talk about are the pinnipeds. So these include the seals, the sea lions, and the walruses. So that's a seal, that's a sea lion, that's a walrus. I'll teach you how to tell them apart in a minute. So all of these evolved from something kind of like a sea otter, right? So their relatives are sea otters. Sea otters are close relatives of rodents and things like that. So these things are kind of closer relatives of rodents. So all of these are carnivores. All of them eat either fishes or eat things without backbones. And all of these do their breeding and their birthing of pups on land, right? So they will hunt for fish and for invertebrates in the ocean, and then typically once a year they will come back to land in order to do their reproducing, to have sex, and to birth their pups. So these in general are found in cold waters. The reason being is that they have a really thick layer of blubber, which makes them really well suited for cold waters. There are some exceptions. There is, for instance, something known as a Hawaiian monk seal, which is found in the warm waters of Hawaii. So they often spend many, many months at sea where they hunt. Some of these, will spend something like 10 or 11 months of the year just out at sea, and then come back to land just one month a year in order to reproduce. So their limbs are obviously different from our limbs. They've been modified into flippers, which are better for thrusting through the water and for maneuvering. And the deepest diver of the group is a southern elephant seal, which you see here in this picture. So they can dive down to close to 7,000 feet, or at least that's the deepest dive ever recorded of a southern elephant seal. We have northern elephant seals on our coastline. They are also very, very deep divers, but not quite as deep as southern elephant seals. There are some really good conservation success stories with pinnipeds. So I know I got you all kind of bummed out about sea turtles because they're all threatened. Well, here's some redemption because the pinnipeds have really done pretty well in the last 100 years. A really good example of this is the northern elephant seal, which we have here on our coastline in California. So these were hunted nearly to extinction up through the early 1900s. In fact, there's only roughly 100 left in the wild. Why people were hunting them is that they were gathering the blubber from them and rendering the blubber into an oil that was used for cooking and for lighting. Obviously, we don't use whale or seal blubber anymore because now we have electricity to heat our homes and to use for making light in our home. So like I was telling you before, only 100 was left in 1910. 110 years later, in 2020, there's now roughly 150,000 of them, right? So they have made a remarkable recovery since it became banned that people would hunt for them, right? So in 1910, there was a ban put in place on hunting them, so people were forced to stop. If you want to see them, go up to San Simeon. Right, so San Simeon is up a little bit past like San Luis Obispo, right? So we're down here in LA, right? So there's Oxnard, Santa Barbara, San Luis Obispo, and then San Simeon is up there, just before you get up to like the Bay Area. And there's a beach in San Simeon where certain times of year there will be tons and tons of these that are just hanging out on the beach. The winter time is the best time to go because that's when males and females are reproducing. So that's when you'll see some of the really massive males that can be like 15 feet long, and you'll see the females and you see the newly born pups in the winter time. Okay, I promised that I would teach you the difference between a seal and a sea lion. So there's a couple major differences. Probably the one that would be the most noticeable to you if you were to see one of these is the size of the flippers, right? So the front flippers and hind flippers are very different. On a seal, they have really big front flippers and hind flippers. I'm sorry, on a sea lion, very big front and back flippers. whereas on a seal, very small ones. So when you see a sea lion, it has large enough front flippers that it can prop itself up like that. So if you see a pinniped doing this, it's a sea lion. Whereas a seal, it's got these dinky little flippers. So when seals are moving around, they just kind of do this like kind of worm kind of thing, kind of bouncing along the ground, and they can't prop themselves up. So that's one difference. Another difference is that sea lions have a tiny little ear flap, whereas seals do not have any sort of external ear. Finally, the last thing is that seals have little claws on their front flippers, if you can see them, whereas sea lions do not have those. So when you see seals on the beach, you'll actually sometimes see themselves scratching themselves with their claws, which is I know it doesn't sound incredible, but it's actually pretty cute when they scratch themselves. So those are the pinnipeds. Okay, let's talk about the carnivores a little bit. So first of all, I know that the naming here is a little bit confusing. So, when we say the word carnivore, what we typically are talking about is animals that eat other animals. Whether it's a shark or a sperm whale or a squid, an animal that eats another animal is a carnivore. But there's also an order Carnivora, which is a group of carnivorous mammals that are closely related to each other. So this includes bears, cats, dogs, badgers. Those are all things that are in the order Carnivora. So they are in fact carnivores, but they're also in the order Carnivora. Whereas something like a shark is a carnivore, but is not in the order Carnivora. So these things are all predatory, and sometimes they will scavenge if they get a chance, if they find a tasty dead thing. I'm not going to talk about the polar bears too much, but I will talk about sea otters a little bit. Sea otters are unique amongst the marine mammals in that they don't have any blubber. What they have instead is a very, very thick fur coat. That thick fur coat has something like 1 million hairs in every square inch, right? So think about an inch, like maybe a little bit bigger than the size of your thumbnail, and think about 1 million hairs being packed into that one tiny little area, right? So it's a huge amount of fur, which helps them to stay warm. In comparison, a human head has something like 850 hairs per square inch. Right, so they have something like 1,000 times the density of hair that we do. So they do that to keep warm, and they also have to eat a lot to keep warm, right? So when we eat things, a lot of the energy that is stored in that food ends up getting released in the form of heat. That's a lot of why we are so warm on the inside. So what sea otters do is that they will eat a quarter of their weight every day, right? So 25% of their weight. So like a fully grown sea otter that weighs about 80 pounds, it'll eat 20 pounds of food every single day. So it has this constant food source coming in that is like a fuel to keep themselves warm. In these things, sea otters pretty much spend all their lives in water. So they do their reproducing in water, they birth their pups in the water, they spend all their time in water. And where you see them most commonly is around this brown stuff, which is kelp. So they tend to really like hanging around in kelp forests. In a little bit later in the semester, I'll talk about the very special relationship between sea otters and kelp. Okay, a third group of marine mammals that I wanted to talk about are what are known as the Sirenians. So these include the manatees and the dugongs. So these things are, in some ways kind of similar to a whale or to, say a pinniped, but in other ways they're a little bit different, right? So they have these paddle-like tails, which is more kind of like kind of like a whale or a dolphin. But they're herbivorous, making them almost more like, I don't know, like a sea turtle almost. Whereas pinnipeds and whales and dolphins tend to, eat other animals. So they're different from those other groups in that way. They are fully aquatic, So they spend all of their life in the water. So all their reproducing they do in the water. All the birthing of their pups they do in the water. If you want to see one of these, you'll have to go, a pretty long ways, because we don't have these in California. If you were to go to Southeast Asia, you'd find dugongs there, places like Australia, Indonesia, Philippines. And if you were to go to Florida, inside of like the Everglades and the coastal areas there, that's where you can find manatees living. So unfortunately, of all the 4 species of Sirenians that exist, all of them are endangered. The reason being is that in the old days, people used to hunt them for food. They're presumably because they're so easy to catch, because they are big and kind of slow, and they need to swim to the surface to breathe. So it made them a very easy target for hunters. And now, not many people are hunting them anymore. But an issue that they still face now is propellers. So you see those white scars across the back of that manatee. That was from a boat that basically drove over the top of it. So if you ever happen to be driving a boat in Florida, watch out for manatees, because boats and manatees don't go together so well. Okay, so the last group that we're going to talk about are the cetaceans. So these include the whales, the dolphins, and the porpoises. So these are the things that are fully aquatic, so they're only found in the water. If they come up on land, that's a bad thing for them. With all of these, they are relatives of the hippo, actually. So the ancestor of all of these things were something that was kind of hippo-like. With all of them, their forelimbs, so what would have been their arms essentially, have been modified into flippers, and their rear limbs have been completely lost. Right, so they don't have any rear limb. So it's not as if their legs turned into their tail, into their fluke. Their fluke actually is made from other stuff. It's made just from like proteins at the base of the tail. How these things how these things all breathe is with their blowhole. So their nostrils essentially have moved to the top of their head, in his turned into their blowhole. So even in certain whales today, you can see remnants of their once terrestrial lifestyle. So like I was saying before, these are the descendants of something kind of like a hippo. And in this thing, which is a right whale, it still actually has some pelvic bones just sitting there, not really doing anything, that are a kind of tie over from from back when they used to be something that live on land. Right, so at one point this would have been part of their hind limbs, but now they obviously don't have those, but they still have those bones that are just kind of, getting smaller and smaller, with each generation. So this is an example of a vestigial trait, which is a trait that now serves no function, but would have served a function in the past, when the lifestyle was different. A good example of that in us is our appendix. So so long time ago, thousands of years ago, we didn't cook our food because we hadn't learned how to master fire yet. And as a result, we were eating lots of raw food, in which case it was helpful to have extra bacteria in our gut, to help us break down that food. So our appendix was essentially the organ that would hold that extra bacteria. But now we don't need the appendix so much, right? You can have your appendix removed and be quite happy. And that's because an appendix is a vestigial trait, something that was useful in the past but isn't very useful anymore. Okay, so there are 2 groups of cetaceans, right? There are 2 suborders that we're going to talk about. So there are the Mysticeti, which are the baleen whales, including some of the largest animals on the planet. This is what's known as a right whale, which you can see pretty commonly right off of our coastline in California. And then there is the Odontoceti. So think odont sounds like an orthodontist, who works on teeth. So these are the toothed whales. So it including things like this orca, it includes things like dolphins, it includes things like porpoises. So the smaller, toothier varieties of cetaceans are the Odontoceti. Okay, so the first group of whales we'll talk about will be the baleen whales, the Mysticeti whales. So they're called baleen whales because they have these baleen things. So these are rows of flexible material that is kind of like the material that makes up your hair and your nails. So it's a flexible, but not too flexible type of protein, essentially. And what these work like is kind of like little combs that essentially can be used for trapping bits of food on one side or another. So what all these whales do is they filter feed. So they take in big gulps of water that contain krill or small fishes or sometimes even smaller things. And in doing so, they're able to use their baleen in order to trap those things, trap that krill or the small fishes or the smaller bits of food that are in the water. And so there's kind of a few different ways of doing this. And I've put links on Canvas for you to take a look at how these different ways of doing this, what they look like. So there are things like humpback whales, which gulp big pockets of water. What they typically do is they rush up towards the surface, open their mouth, and gulp in, hundreds and hundreds of gallons of water that contains krill or small fishes. And then those krill or fish are trapped in the mouth of the whale, and it can then expel the water through its baleen, the water that's in its mouth. It kind of pushes it out through its baleen. The water can get through the baleen, but the krill and small fishes cannot. They're trapped in there. So those are the water gulpers. And I put that in quotation marks because that's just what I call them. I don't know that there is an actual terminology for this. At least I've not been able to find one, but they gulp water. Then there are the water netters. What they essentially do is they swim through the water very slowly with their mouth open, and they trap very small things like copepods in the water. In their baleen plates kind of act like little nets that trap the copepods, so that they work like a net being dragged through the water. And then finally, the gray whales, which we have off our coastline here, what they kind of do is they kind of rub their face against the seafloor where the seafloor is kind of sandy or muddy. And in doing so, they stir up small things like copepods and amphipods out of the bottom. And they then use their baleen plates in order to trap those copepods or amphipods that are in the water. So that's how they do it. So they just kind of rub their face along the seafloor. One really kind of remarkable behavior that certain baleen whales will use is what's known as bubble netting. And I have a video of this on Canvas for you to take a look at. What they essentially do is a group of whales will work together where a couple of whales will swim in a circle kind of underneath the water, and they blow bubbles out of their blowholes. And so those bubbles go up to the surface. And in doing so, all of the small fish or krill that are in here, they all get scared of the bubbles and go to the middle. So essentially they get concentrated in the middle of this circle. And then all the whales, all at one time, they come rushing up towards the surface with their mouths open and scoop up huge amounts of water with huge amounts of krill or fish inside. They can capture, hundreds of pounds of krill or fish all in one gulp. So that's bubble netting, and it's really pretty remarkable, a pretty remarkable behavior that requires coordination and kind of team working in order to make it happen. Okay, let's talk about the toothed whales a little bit. Right, so these again include larger toothed whales like this killer whale or sperm whales or pilot whales, and they include smaller things like dolphins or porpoises. By the way, the difference between a dolphin and a porpoise is that dolphins have a long snout, kind of like a bottle-shaped snout, which is why some of them are called bottlenose dolphins, whereas porpoises do not have that. Porpoises also are a lot less common and tend to be a little bit smaller than dolphins. So, but toothed whales are the Odontoceti whales, and they consume larger prey than the baleen whales, right? So they might be capturing fish or squids. Some get even larger things like pinnipeds. Some even hunt other types of whales. Some will eat invertebrate animals. So they eat all sorts of different animals. They're very much carnivorous. So let's talk a little bit about a couple of interesting behaviors that I think are worth noting amongst the cetaceans. So first of all, these are all things that have large brains, right? So a sperm whale has the largest brain of any animal in the animal kingdom. And so with those large brains, they're capable of doing very remarkable things, right? They can learn from watching each other and they can do some pretty cool things. For instance, they can vocalize a lot. Right, so whales have their own versions of languages that they use vocalizations in order to communicate. Right, so making loud whale calls and clicks and whistles and such that they use for communicating with each other. Cetaceans typically live in social structures where there'll be a group of whales or dolphins or porpoises or whatnot, uh, in which there is some sort of social structure where there will be like an alpha male or an alpha female that kind of leads things, and then other individuals around them. And those individuals will all kind of work together while hunting or caring for young and such. These things can do what's known as social learning. We kind of talked about that in the context of octopi that can learn from watching each other. Well, cetaceans, it's no surprise that they can do it too, right? So they can watch each other and learn how to do important tasks. Maybe one of the most fantastic stories about cetaceans, and one that illustrates their intelligence, is something that happened in Southeast Australia through the like 1700s and 1800s. And what happened was cooperation between whalers, so human whalers that were catching baleen whales, and orcas. And how that kind of worked is that the orcas in this one particular bay, they would kind of trap and scare baleen whales into that bay. And then they had a particular signal that they would use to kind of tell the whalers, hey, we got one. We have a whale trapped in the bay. Why don't you come out and kill it? And so that's what the whalers would do. They would come kill that baleen whale. In return for their services, the whalers would give the orcas the tongue of the whale, right? So the tongue was what the orcas are really after. And so the whalers would take out the tongue and give it to the orcas. And that was the kind of agreement that they had. The orcas would help trap the larger baleen whales, and the whalers would then give them the tongue of it. Which it almost seems too hard it almost seems too unlikely to be true, except when you see pictures like this, where you can see that's kind of going on. Or you can even see in a museum in Southeast Australia, they have the lead orca that was doing this for a while. So there was an orca named Old Tom, and he was kind of the leader of this pack of orcas for some period of time. And so when he died, they took all the meat off his bones and put him in the aquarium, or museum, I should say. So they have the actual skeleton of one of the orcas that was actually doing this. So it seems too hard to be true, but all indications would seem to point to the fact that this is something that really happened. Cetaceans, of course, oftentimes are involved in very long migrations, in navigating really long distances. Along our coastline here, you will see that going on with gray whales and humpback whales, for instance. So both of them, they spend their summer times up in the Arctic, so off of like Alaska, in Russia, and Canada. So summertime up there. They go up there in the summertime because there's lots and lots of food up there. So lots of krill and small fish up there that they can eat. And then when the days get shorter and it gets colder, they leave the Arctic, go along the whole Pacific coast of North America, down into either the Sea of Cortez or off of Baja, Mexico. where they will then spend the winter time there, because the winter time, here is obviously a lot nicer than the winter time up in Alaska, where it's cold and frigid and dark all the time. And gray whales and humpback whales, they're not the only ones that do that. There are whales that are along Asia, that will migrate up to the Arctic and back and forth. There are whales that will spend time in the summertime off of Antarctica, and then migrate back north and spend their winter times closer to the equator. Kind of the general thing that happens is that whales spend the winter time around the equator, and then summer times they go to the Arctic or to the Antarctic. Okay, another kind of cool cetacean behavior that not many other things have is what's known as echolocation, that the toothy whales use. So they make these click noises, and in doing so, they can locate prey. So some of you might be thinking, oh, that sounds like the same thing that bats do, which is exactly correct. So bats use a similar thing. They use echolocation. And so how cetaceans do this is that they have this thing called a melon inside of their head, which is why a lot of porpoises and bottlenose dolphins still have this kind of bulbous-shaped head. And that melon produces these clicking noises that go out into the water. Those clicks bounce off of something such as a fish, go back towards the whale or the dolphin, and the dolphin or whale can feel those sounds coming back with their lower jaw. They then use that information to determine where that fish is, right? So they can use this thing for hunting for fish that they can't even see. So this is what's known as echolocation. And essentially the longer the time it takes for that sound to go out and hit a fish and go back, the further away the fish is, essentially. Okay, let's talk a little bit about deep diving mammals. So the deepest diving of all of the mammals, at least that we know of, is the Cuvier's beaked whale, which dives to depths of almost 10,000 feet, so roughly 2 miles deep. Which, if you were to think of that in terms of Empire State Buildings, I guess I don't know how useful an analogy that is to all of you West Coast peeps. But if you've seen the Empire State Building, imagine 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 of them on top of each other. That's how deep these things dive down into the ocean, which is pretty remarkable. That's in contrast with humans, which are way weaker than that. Right, so the deepest diving human, just taking a breath of air and diving down, is 830 feet, which is, in fact, pretty damn impressive. I will, let you know that they had some help. Essentially, to do a dive of that depth, the person would have carried a very heavy weight to get down to that depth very quickly, and then would have really big, really good fins for then getting back to the surface really quickly. So they do have some good tools for this, but still incredibly impressive, to be able to hold your breath for multiple minutes and to dive to a depth of that. Deepest dive on scuba, so using a scuba tank, is over 1,000 feet. Only maybe like a dozen or so humans have ever done that because it's an incredibly dangerous thing to do. The deepest dive I've ever done to was 160 feet. Which is still way deeper than most other scuba divers have gone to, but 160 feet versus 9,816 feet. There's really no comparison. So let's talk a little bit about how marine mammals are so good at diving to great depths. And this, by the way, is a Cuvier's beaked whale. So that's that whale that can dive to almost 10,000 feet. So some of the things they do is they're really good at extracting oxygen from air. So their lungs can extract up to 90% of the oxygen in the air inside of their lungs. Whereas us, we can only extract about 20%, which is crazy, really inefficient, right? So when you breathe in air, you actually only use about 20% of the oxygen in it. And then when you breathe out, there's still 80%, that 80% of oxygen is still in that air. Whereas whales can use a lot more of it, or marine mammals in general can use a lot more of it. Marine mammals in general have more blood and more hemoglobin. right? So blood is obviously how you carry oxygen throughout your body. And so the more blood you have, the more oxygen you can pump around your body. Hemoglobin is the protein on the surface of blood that is used for transporting oxygen. And so because they have more blood, they have more hemoglobin. They also have more of something known as myoglobin. So myoglobin is oxygen storage in the muscles. So they have a lot more of that, a lot more oxygen ready in their muscles to be used. When marine mammals go on deep dives, they're really, really efficient with the use of their oxygen, right? So they're not using crazy amounts of oxygen. What they do is they slow their hearts down so that as they're diving, they're using less of that limited supply of oxygen. And people that are skilled at scuba diving or free diving, they're good at this too. I'm even pretty efficient at this. You know, if you can kind of slow your heart down and be really calm when you're underwater, then you use less air and you can stay down longer. So through hundreds of dives that I've done, you know, I've gotten pretty good at slowing my heart rate and staying underwater as long as I can. Probably the main difference, or probably a pretty major difference between them and us, is that their lungs can shrink a lot without rupturing. So that beaked whale that went down to almost 10,000 feet. So it went down something like 300 meters, which means that where it went, the pressure was 30 times greater than it is up at the surface, which means that its lungs would have shrunk down to 30 times smaller than they would be at the surface, which is incredible that their lungs can shrink that small without rupturing, without tearing. As for us, you could not have your lungs shrink to that tiny little size without rupturing. You know, your lungs would be shredded if they were shrunk down to a size of just 1/30th of what they normally are. So that perhaps is the most remarkable adaptation that deep diving marine mammals have, is their lungs' ability to not rupture under these crazy amounts of pressure and stress. Okay, one last thing I wanted to talk about with whales is a little bit about whaling. So I think most of you know that a lot of whales were hunted nearly to the brink of extinction. Why we were hunting them was for the same reason we were hunting seals. Whales have a lot of blubber in them, and that blubber can be rendered into oil, which can then be used for heating, for cooking, and for lighting. Of course, we don't need that anymore because we have electricity. But up until the early 1900s, that's what a lot of Europeans were using was whale oil in order to heat and light and cook with. So in 1946, there was an international whaling commission. So international meaning multiple countries came together. And what they decided was, hey, the whales are almost extinct. We need to stop doing this, otherwise they're going to be gone. And so an international ban was put in place on whaling by all of the nations that agreed to that 1946 whaling commission. Here in the U.S., so we signed on to that agreement in 1946, and then some years later, in 1972, the U.S. Marine Mammal Protection Act was put in place. So this then extended the protections to not just be whales, but to all marine mammals. So in 1972, all marine mammals, so seals, sea lions, whales, sea otters, all those things got protection from the U.S. federal government. In a lot of cases, there was already bans on the hunting of those animals, but 1972, that's when it was federally made illegal by the U.S. Marine Mammal Protection Act. So now there's not a lot of whaling going on, which is great. There are some examples, or some exceptions, I should say. So in Japan, in Norway, and Iceland, there is still some whaling going on. And actually, in Canada, there's a little bit of it going on too. In Norway and Canada, it's mostly people hunting it kind of to fulfill their sort of cultural heritage. They're sort of like they're kind of fulfilling what their ancestors did. So in Norway and in Canada, there's not a lot of whales being caught. It's all by indigenous people that are that get a right to hunt for a small amount of whales to kind of fulfill their cultural heritage. In Japan and Iceland, not really the same case. So there's a lot of whaling going on in both of those countries, and people are eating whales. Not just people that are indigenous, but everyday people. In fact, when my wife and I went to Iceland a few years ago, we were in the capital city of Reykjavik and just kind of strolling around looking for a place to eat dinner. And we actually found a restaurant that had whale on the menu. So don't worry, we didn't go in and eat the whale, but I was shocked at how easy it was in Iceland to find a place where you could actually eat whale. So whales. So the good news is that very few countries still have whaling, aside from those exceptions that I just mentioned. So many whales are in fact recovering. This is the abundance of humpback whales on the west coast. And you can see this is only going up to 2003, but you can see it's been steadily increasing over time, which is great news. It would be great if they would recover a little bit faster. But the thing about whales is that they live to really long ages. They don't reproduce that frequently. So it's going to take some time before they recover to the numbers that they once occurred in before we started whaling, just because they grow so slowly and they don't produce offspring very often. So it's going to take time before we get back to pre-whaling levels. But we will eventually get there as long as protection does stay in place for whales. Okay, so that's the end of the marine mammal, marine reptile, marine bird chapter. And that's actually the end of the taxonomy part of the course, right? So over the past few chapters, we've been talking about different groups of animals and plants that are in the ocean. So we're done with that now. And now we're going to shift our focus to the ecology of marine ecosystems. And we're going to go into depth with a few different types of marine ecosystems and kind of talk a little bit more about how they function.